Американскиот професор Френсис Фукујама е познат политички научник, писател, автор, а најпознат е по неговото дело Крајот на историјата и последниот човек. Ова недела престојуваше во Скопје во рамки на соработката на Институтот за демократија Societas Civilis и Американскиот универзитет Стенфорд. Тој е гостин во ова неделно интервју на Радио Слободна Европа. Професоре Фукујама, светот е во очекување како ќе заврши руската инвазија врз Украина. Вашата оценка е дека мотивот на Владимир Путин е неговата интенција да ја подкопа демократијата. Без разлика како и да заврши ова, каква е вашата оценка? Како ќе изгледа светот по тоа?
Well, I think that the outcome of the conflict will determine what the world looks like. And I think you can imagine a very bad scenario from the standpoint of democracy and a good scenario. The bad scenario, obviously, is if Putin succeeds in overthrowing the elected regime in Kyiv, installs a puppet government, and succeeds in somehow incorporating parts or the whole of Ukraine into a larger Russia. But on the other hand, I think it's quite unlikely that he's going to succeed at that, and he may get bogged down and, in some scenarios actually be forced to withdraw from Ukraine, which would be quite humiliating for him. And in that case, it seems to me that there'll be a good outcome because not good for the Ukrainians, it'll be terrible for the Ukrainians, but for the democratic world as a whole, they will have shown solidarity, they would have resisted aggression, and they would have preserved the kind of European order that has existed since 1991.
Постои ли опасност за создавање на два паралелни света? Русија е на своји собствени социјални медиуми, најавува и свој интернет, западните земји се на други социјални мрежи. Каде би се сретнале овие два света?
Well, I think that the Russians are already trying to separate themselves from the Western internet and the Western media space. And certainly the invasion and all the sanctions that followed are going to accelerate that process. I think to some extent they might try to plug into the Chinese. The Chinese have already created their own internet. They don't allow their citizens to access Western sources, and they're a big enough country that they can create their own media space. Russia can join that, but I don't think they'd like being a junior partner of China in that respect. So they're going to have a problem because they're really not a large enough country that they can do what the Chinese are doing and have their own internet and their own separate, platforms and the like. But they will try to do it on their own.
Која е опасноста од таа поделба?
I think that the separation is dangerous insofar as different parts of the world can create their own realities. It's already the case that Russia has shut its own population off from any real knowledge of what's going on in Ukraine. And so they're being told this is a limited military operation. It's not a war, it's not an invasion. The Ukrainians aren't being hurt. And as a result, many Russians think there's nothing wrong going on. And that separation and isolation is obviously going to continue. There's a question, though, whether that's possible because, there are going to be mothers that aren't going to have their sons coming home because they've been killed in Ukraine. I think there'll be a lot of information leaking out because really the technological world makes it very hard to really isolate an entire country. So it will be, it'll be dangerous, but there will be limits to how much separation there can be.
Професоре, вашата оценка е дека либералниот свет каков што постои сега не треба веќе да се зема здраво за готово, туку дека се работи за постојана борба. Истовремено се повеќе луѓе ни светот се воодушевуваат на авторитарни лидери. Колку сето ова ја прави таа борба потешка и постои ли опасност за иднината на демократиите во светот?
I think one of the biggest changes that's happened in the past few years is that in addition to these geopolitical threats like Russia and China, many democracies now have an internal threat. They have a far right or a populist right that doesn't fully accept democracy and is a threat to democracy internally. We've seen that very vividly in the United States with the rise of Donald Trump and the movement that he represents. On January 6th of last year, they stormed the Capitol and they tried to overturn an election violently. And quite frankly, they would like to try to do that again in 2024 when we have our next presidential election. And so I think there's a very severe threat that democracies are facing, not just externally, but within their own political systems. Most European countries have a far-right, extremist party, and that's something that they have to guard against.
Украинскиот претседател Володимир Зеленски постојано вели дека во Украина се брани и Европа. Европските земји презема економски санкции кон Русија. Дали се тие доволни според вас?
I don't think that economic sanctions by themselves will be enough to punish Russia. I think, fundamentally, what happens on the ground militarily will be the more important outcome. I think that if the Ukrainians can stop the Russian invasion and even reverse it and impose very heavy military costs on Russia, that's really what's going to persuade Putin to back down, and that is what's going to threaten his position in Russia. But there's no question that the economic sanctions will have a very big impact on the Russian people. They're going to experience a big recession with unemployment and great disruption to the kind of middle-class lives that many of them have come to expect.
Професоре, како оценувате позицијата на Кина во однос на руската инвазија врз Украина? Има ли можност за прелевање на конфликтот и во тој дел од светот?
I think that China is largely on Russia's side, but they're not completely on Russia's side because they've made respect for other countries' sovereignty one of the central pillars of their foreign policy. And so they haven't, for example, simply endorsed a Russian invasion, where you undermine the sovereignty of another country. I think many people believe that they're watching this very carefully in making their own plans for what to do about Taiwan. Taiwan, they believe, is part of China. There's been a lot of speculation in recent years that they may actually use military means to forcibly reincorporate Taiwan. And obviously the American and the Western reaction to that is something they will take into account. I would say that one of the good impacts of the Ukraine invasion is that it shows that the Western world is ready to fight back, and it won't be so easy to simply use military force. But we don't know really what's going through the minds of Chinese leaders. We can only speculate about the conclusions they may have drawn.
Во контекст на Македонија, земјава веќе 2 години чека датум за почеток на преговори со Европската унија поради блокадата од Бугарија. Спорот со официјална Софија почна пред се со историски идентитетски прашања, па многумина тука препознаа сличност со она што го зборуваше Путин пред нападот врз Украина. Какво е вашето мислење? Има ли сличности?
Well, I think that there is a lot of similarity because you have, in the case of North Macedonia, one country, a larger country, that wants to deny North Macedonia the right to frame its own national identity in a way that's just different and has a different historical narrative from the one in Bulgaria. And that's really the same thing that the Russians are claiming with regard to Ukraine. I think a fundamental principle of both democracy and international relations is that each people should be free to determine their own narrative and not have that dictated by other countries, other larger countries that want to tell them a different story. So I think in that respect they're quite similar.
На Балканот Белград и Приштина имаат отворени прашања. Ситуацијата во Босна и Херцеговина е доста комплицирана. Каква е вашата оценка? Има ли опасност од прелевање на конфликтот на Балканот?
I think that if Putin gets away with subduing Ukraine and using military force successfully, and the Western alliance can't do anything to stop him, that's going to have a big spillover effect because there are certainly many actors in the Balkans that would like to do the same thing. You know, the Serbs in Bosnia have been unhappy with the result of the Dayton Accord and you know, want to declare independence of the Republika Srpska and so forth. And I think this will just encourage them if that happens. On the other hand, if the alliance holds together and Putin isn't successful, then that's probably a good thing that will limit the spillover effects. But you know, the thing about war is that you really cannot never predict what the long-term effects of a conflict are going to be, and they're usually quite different from what people imagined before the conflict began.
Што препорачувате за малите демократи и кршливи, како македонската и многу други низ светот? Што треба да направат за да станат поотпорни пред налетот на авторитаризмот?
I think that the agenda for any country is both internal and external, and the two are related. So there are many challenges to governance in, you know, in North Macedonia. There's problems of corruption, there's problems of national identity, and these are things that need to be addressed, you know, if the political system is going to work adequately. But there's also, you know, especially for a small country, the question of external alignments, and in that respect, you know, getting help from other democracies is important. I understand and appreciate the fact that North Macedonia has been very disappointed in the response of the European Union, you know, to its efforts to join, and I think that's really too bad. As an outsider, I can't really do very much about this, but it does seem that you know, there ought to be greater receptivity and awareness of the consequences of EU membership for, you know, for a place like this.
Внутришните поделби во многу демократски општества се видливи, а наративите како шовинизмот, национализмот, кои што се сметаше дека припаѓаат на минатото, повторно се враќаат. Што мислите дека е причина за сето ова?
I think that there are several reasons. One has to do with complacency. You know, we've gone through a 30-year period since the end of the Cold War where you've had relative peace and security in this entire region with no active military conflict, with no direct experience of really terrible dictatorship. And, you know, people begin to forget the benefits of living in a democratic and a liberal world order. They begin to demand more, and I think these questions of the assertion of national identity, you know, becomes more powerful in moments like this. One thing that may be the outcome of this Russian invasion is a greater appreciation for why it's good to live in a liberal order in which you don't simply use military force to achieve your objectives. So that's one possible, you know, good effect that might come out of this.
Професоре Фукујама, ви благодарам на одвоеното време.
Thank you very much.
Тоа беше се во неделното интервју на Радио Слободна Европа. Довидување до следната недела.